known as her brother. Good morning. I hope you can all hear me. It's so good to be here. And honestly, I can hardly believe this is my first visit ever to Sweden. So it's another added privilege to be with you in this difficult time of our collective humanity. And I wish I was addressing you about a different topic in different circumstances. But today, more than ever, we as faith leaders have to raise up our voices, speak with conviction, and more importantly, challenge our own traditions, our own theological traditions, and ask difficult questions such as, how did we get here? My talk today is a direct engagement with the positions and public witness of the Church of Sweden vis-a-vis Palestine over the last 5 years. And of course, I don't write from distance. I'm not an academic per se, but I'm writing from within an ongoing theological and ecclesial conversations. And these conversations are both important and necessary today. And I will use the Church of Sweden as an example because my aim is to examine how a major European mainline Protestant church has articulated its stance on Palestine, particularly in a moment of moral and theological urgency, and to ask what theological assumptions and frameworks undergird these responses. And I write, of course, as one who speaks from within the family. I am a Lutheran pastor based right now in Palestine and Ramallah, and I hold deep respect and appreciation for the Church of Sweden, for its long-standing engagement with Palestine, for its solidarity over the years, and for its tangible support to our church and our people. It's within this context that I present this critique. It is precisely because of this relationship of that church tradition and of this history of accompaniment that this conversation is not only necessary, but it actually makes it more painful for us Palestinians. Now, in many of my conversations with European churches, especially when we address the issue of Christian Zionism, I often encounter the response that, yes, they agree with our critique of Christian Zionism. I'm talking about European churches. And they assert that this phenomena is largely problematic, but they speak of it exclusively as something that's confined to the United States, particularly among fundamentalist evangelical communities. That's usually the assumption, that when we talk about Christian Zionism, European churches think we're talking about something else. This is what I would like to challenge in this talk, that Christian Zionism is not outside of the framework of mainline Protestant churches. Christian Zionism is not one shape and form. It is diverse, it is adaptive, and it's capable of taking different forms depending on the context. So I will argue that it can also manifest itself maybe in more subtle and complex ways within mainline liberal Protestant churches. So the Church of Sweden here serves as a case study, again, not because it's unique, but precisely because it represents a broader pattern. And at the same time, before I get into my arguments, it's important to acknowledge that within these churches and within the Church of Sweden, there are many individuals, clergy, leaders, theologians, who have stood in solidarity, indeed costly solidarity, with the Palestinian people, and who have embraced what may be described as a prophetic critique of empire. This tradition, articulated clearly, for example, in movements such as Kairos Palestine, and echoed with the Kairos Sweden movement, Kairos Sabir, calls the church to speak truth to power, to name injustice, and to align itself with the oppressed. And so my engagement, therefore, is not with all members as if all are the same. I, of course, recognize that within the churches I often speak to, there are different and diverse voices, and we appreciate those who stood in solidarity with us. So let me dig into my main arguments about how did the Church of Sweden respond to the war in Gaza. But I find myself having to begin by examining a key moment prior to the war on Gaza, which was the response of the bishops to a proposal by the Church Council, the Synod, to investigate and engage with the question of whether Israel should be described as an apartheid state. I'm sure you remember what I'm talking about. I think this is a very significant moment, and I don't think it's an isolated decision or isolated incident. We must look at it as part of a broader pattern. Because to me, the response have helped shape and in many ways anticipate the ways in which churches have responded to Gaza and to Palestine more generally. And to me, whenever I look at how churches responded to the war on Gaza, I keep finding myself going back to Karlsruhe in the World Council of Churches, when we were rebuked as Palestinians and South Africans for merely suggesting that the World Council of Churches should consider the question of apartheid when it comes to Israel's practices. Those of you who were there know what I'm talking about. Because it's in that moment that churches decided that the international law should not apply to Palestinians. So let's go to that moment. Let's revisit what happened then. The proposal was not actually a proposal by the Synod to name Israel as an apartheid state. It was much less than that. It was about examining, looking at the reports, seeing whether Israel is violating the human rights of Palestinians and responding to the questions raised, responding theologically to the questions raised by respected human rights organizations and legal scholars. Now, the response from the bishops, particularly those who opposed the initiative, was striking to say the least. Because the very act of considering whether the framework of apartheid might be applicable was resisted, was questioned, and in some cases strongly criticized. This resistance is revealing. It suggests that the issue at stake was not merely a disagreement over terminology, but a deeper reluctance to allow certain frameworks, apartheid, especially those grounded in international law, to be applied to Israel in the first place. As if you're suggesting Israel is above the international law. And this was before the genocide, before all the war crimes in Gaza. And again, to me, what is particularly troubling is that the controversy emerged at the level of investigation, not conclusion. The church was not being asked to declare Israel as an apartheid state, but simply to take seriously the question based on the reports. To me, this is difficult to reconcile with the church's own self-understanding, because as articulated in various statements of the church, including those of its leadership, there's a clear emphasis on the importance of international law and the universality of human rights. That's what we were told. Yet in this instance, one is compelled to ask, does international law apply equally to all contexts, or are there exceptions? And to be more precise, are Palestinians included within the moral and legal frameworks that the church so strongly affirms everywhere? That is the deeper question we must ask, And that is what that moment revealed. That the slogans that human rights apply universally don't really hold. Because when there were questions about whether the human rights of Palestinians were violated, many protested. Many protested even questioning that. Again, not affirming it. From a Palestinian perspective, it's really hard to emphasize how troubling and how devastated we were when we saw the controversy. What's the controversy? It raised questions that go beyond policy and terminology, and some thought, why are you Palestinians so pointed on or stuck on issues like terminology? This is not about terminology. Because when even the investigation of apartheid is deemed controversial, one cannot help but ask whether this reflects an underlying posture, perhaps unintentional, yet nonetheless real, which is one of condescension. A posture in which European institutions assume the authority to define the limits of discourse, to determine when and how international law may be invoked, and to do so in ways that appear disconnected from the lived realities of those on the ground. Even worse, as I said, we as Palestinians were rebuked for pushing for that question. And again, this is not to deny that there were voices within the church, bishops, clergy, and lay leaders who supported the initiative, defended it, paid a heavy price for that, and advocated for a more honest, courageous engagement with the question. Their efforts must be acknowledged. However, the fact that such advocacy was necessary and that it encountered significant resistance is itself indicative of a broader problem. As if it seems you have to advocate for the humanity of Palestinians. This is how it felt from our sides. And again, to me, this was not simply one isolated incident. It represents a formative instance that helps explain the future responses of churches, because that's when human rights violations, war crimes were committed live on earth, and we still did not see any condemnation from the churches. So this incident, to me, was very revealing. I would like next to move to the question of how did the church respond to the war on Gaza during the war. And I would like to do so by examining an important statement that came from the bishops of the Church of Sweden, issued almost a month after the war began. And to me, it's another example of how church statements can at times seemingly endorse and even justify what became a genocide. The statement was issued November 6, 2023. And it begins, as many such statements, most statements then, with words of sympathy and the call for peace, and then it turns to comment on the actions of Hamas on October 7th. So let me quote what was said about these actions. Quoting, Hamas has indiscriminately and brutally killed children and civilians, desecrated their bodies, ruthlessly taken hostages, and fired thousands of rockets at civilian targets in Israel. We condemn the Hamas attack. Hamas is also holding its own people hostage by hiding among the people of Gaza and using them as human shields. All these actions are reprehensible and in violation of international law. End quote. So in this section of the statement, the actions of Hamas are clearly and forcefully condemned. They are described as indiscriminate, brutal, and ruthless. The statement highlights the desecration of bodies and the deliberate targeting of civilians. It also adopts the now familiar narrative that Hamas is using civilians as human shields, an argument I will argue is very dehumanizing of Palestinians and normalizes the killing of Palestinian civilians. And the conclusion is unambiguous. These actions are reprehensible and in violation of international law and therefore must be condemned. However, when the statement turns to the actions of Israel, the tone and indeed the entire moral framework completely shifts. The statement first emphasizing Israel's, and I quote, self-evident right to defend itself against the violence and terror directed against its population, end quote. And here I want to pause and note, I have never seen a church statement recognize that Palestinians have the right to defend themselves against Israeli violence and terror. Honestly, in all my life of advocacy, I have never seen, I don't know what needs to happen for a European church to say Palestinians have the right to defend themselves. Even though we are the colonized, we are the occupied. And in the case of Gaza, people of Gaza are the ones besieged. But of course, here the framework is that only Israel has the right to defend itself. Moreover, the statement adopts what has become the standard narrative, as I said, framing the world, namely, and everything as if it began on October 7th. It is presented as if October 7th emerged in a vacuum and as if it had no history, no context, and no preceding reality. The General Secretary of Kairos Palestine, Rifat Qassis, usually says, you know, when you open the Bible, in the beginning, there was October 7th. This is how European churches function. Now let me be clear. Pointing to context is not about justifying what happened on that day, nor about excusing the actions of Hamas. October 7th must be named for what it was, including the grave violations that took place, and must be called out. Killing children is wrong. Kidnapping children is wrong. Our question is, why don't you apply that to when Palestinian children are kidnapped and killed? But without context, one cannot arrive at a truthful understanding of reality. And without truth, there can be no moral or theological discernment. So to ignore the context is not neutrality, it is distortion. And what has been particularly striking and deeply troubling is how the broader context has been almost entirely absent from the response of many churches, including the Church of Sweden in this statement. Whether it's the 16 years of siege on Gaza, one of the most prolonged and severe blockades in modern history, and it was not mentioned. A siege that made the General Secretary of the UN, Guterres, say, if there is hell for the children in the world, it is hell for the children of Gaza. He said this before the war. The ongoing reality of occupation, dispossession, and what Palestinians understand as the continuing Nakba, the catastrophe, is overlooked in the statement. And without this context, the events of October 7th are not only misunderstood, they are misinterpreted in ways that shape everything that follows. Again, this is not to justify what happened on October 7th. Killing civilians must be condemned. But this is about looking at the wider context. When the story begins on October 7th, the conclusion becomes almost inevitable. Israel is responding, defending itself, and therefore its actions, no matter how devastating, are framed within this logic. Now, the statement moves into a descriptive, almost neutral, and you will see what I mean, almost neutral narrative mode to explain what followed October 7th, without issuing comparable moral judgments about Israel's actions. So this is now back to the statement of the bishops a month into the war, when thousands had been killed, including thousands of children. The statement says, and I quote, and listen carefully, in all wars, international humanitarian law applies. Civilians must be protected, and both the precautionary principle and the principle of proportionality must be applied. But for almost a month, thousands of civilians in Gaza, including many children, have been killed in Israeli airstrike in violation of these principles. In the Gaza Strip, there is a human tragedy and humanitarian catastrophe with enormous suffering. Hundreds of thousands of people have fled from the north to the south. There is an acute shortage of water and electricity is largely knocked out. The healthcare system is overwhelmed. Medicines and medical equipment are lacking. The humanitarian convoys that have been allowed into Gaza so far are totally inadequate. End quote. I hope you notice what's happening here. Israel is never condemned. Did you notice? War crimes are not explicitly named. The actions of Israel are not described as indiscriminate, brutal, or ruthless, the same way Hamas actions were described. There is no mention of the desecration of thousands of Palestinian children's bodies by bombs, where we literally saw people collecting body parts from the streets and hospitals. Nothing was mentioned about that. Instead, what we were given is the language of human tragedy. A tragedy that deserves sympathy, yes, but which somehow remains within the boundaries of legitimate self-defense, maybe. The statement does not really condemn and say Israel is blocking aid from entering, but there is human tragedy. It could have been an earthquake. The statement then moved to what calls an appeal. See the double standards, then the appeal. And even here, it does not call for a ceasefire, but only for what it terms humanitarian pauses. So this is what the statement called for. Again, let me quote. That all sides in the conflict abide by international humanitarian law in the event of war, that Hamas immediately releases all the hostages, nothing about the Palestinian hostages, the prisoners, nothing, we're not human, doesn't matter, we can stay and rot and be killed in the prisons. Do you know, by the way, that since October 7th, more than 60 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli jails? Does anyone talk about them? Back to the statement. That Hamas stopped firing rockets at civilians in Israel. That Israel's military response take into account the safety of civilians. It doesn't say Israel should stop firing, but that they take the safety of civilians. That humanitarian pauses in the war be created and safe corridors be established so that water, food, medicine, and other necessities can reach the civilian population in Gaza. Doesn't matter, it doesn't say whose responsibility is it. And that the states of the world after the war work for a sustainable and just peace in Israel and Palestine. End quote. And again, the asymmetry is striking. The appeal calls for Hamas to release all the hostages, yet nothing is mentioned about the thousands of Palestinian prisoners, including hundreds of children, many of whom are held without trial. These prisoners, it seems, are not considered worthy of mention in the Sweden's statement. Hamas must stop firing rockets at civilians in Israel, but Israel can continue firing at Gaza. It is asked only to take into account the safety of civilians, something that in practice has never been demonstrated. Everyone knows that. The statement does not mention the destruction of entire neighborhoods, does not mention attacks on churches, mosques, hospitals. These realities remain outside of the moral language of the appeal. Perhaps more tellingly, the bishops advocated for humanitarian pauses, but not for a ceasefire. And I remember when we read this, we were outraged as Palestinians. In other words, Israel is asked to ensure that Palestinians are fed before they are killed. Israel is asked to ensure that, and it doesn't say Israel, by the way. I'm interpreting that maybe they're asking Israel, because they say we want humanitarian pauses. Maybe they want, I don't know who to impose them. Because the statement doesn't ask anything of Israel. It seems, some things. Israel is asked to ensure that Palestinians are fed before continuing its military campaign that is killing those very same Palestinians. Finally, I want to make one more comment about that statement, which is the fact that it mentioned the language of Palestinians being used as human shields. Again, something repeated by many statements, other churches. To me, the fact that such language is repeated by church leaders is deeply troubling and indeed shocking to us. To begin with, let's pause, because even if it were proven that Hamas has used civilians as human shields, it remains a clear violation of international law to target those civilians. This is a foundational principle. And yet I do not see this principle being clearly or consistently affirmed by churches, despite its long-standing emphasis on international law and human rights. And second, the argument itself that Hamas using Palestinians as human shields is often accepted as face value, without scrutiny. Claims made by Israel regarding human shields are repeated, but rarely interrogated. And yet throughout this war, we have seen numerous instances of misinformation and unverified claims. One of the most prominent examples was the assertion that Hamas had its central command headquarters under a Shifa hospital. We've heard this over and over. A claim used to justify the assault on the hospital, and the result was devastation, the targeting of medical facilities, the collapse of care, and immense human suffering. And yet, the evidence presented afterwards fell short of the claims that justified such destruction. But of course, churches have no problem repeating whatever Israel says. By the way, in the very same period, there was a study, a poll made by Israeli newspaper that found that among the Israeli public, the Israeli Jewish public, only 4% trust the claims of Netanyahu regarding the war. 96% of Israelis know Netanyahu lies all the time. But churches take the statements from Israel as infallible, you know? Now, beyond the legality and factual accuracy, there's also another concern about this argument of human shields, one that is moral and theological. Because the logic of human shields arguments does humanize Palestinians. It shifts responsibility for their deaths onto them or onto those allegedly hiding among them. And it suggests that their lives become secondary, even expandable, within the logic of war. So let me help you understand what I'm saying. Imagine a scenario in Sweden. A violent criminal escapes prison, goes to Stockholm, and takes children hostage in a school. Would the Church of Sweden then support bombing the school in order to eliminate the individual and then attribute the deaths of the children to the criminal? Really? Of course not. I hope you see what's happening here. Because the lives of the children cannot be rendered expandable regardless of who is responsible for the situation. And yet when it comes to Palestinians, always a different logic seems to apply. And this is precisely what makes the use of such language by church leaders so deeply disturbing. And as if one is tempted then to interpret the early statements of the church with generosity, as words spoken in the first weeks of war, you might think, why are you using the statement from the first month of war? Let's go to 2 years into the war. The language has not fundamentally changed because there was a statement from the bishops of the Church of Sweden in May 2025. Even then, 2 years into the war, after immense devastation, mass killing, widespread starvation, we still find no clear condemnation, no moral clarity in naming the crime. 2 months, 2 years, I mean. Read the statement. The statement continues to frame the situation within the same cautious language, still anchored in the context, because it begins with October 7th, and still avoiding truth-telling as its deepest level. And even in the appeals of that statement, 2 years into the genocide, the imbalance in telling. The bishops rightly called for the release of all hostages. We support that then and now. They were released, thank God. But there is no mention of Palestinian prisoners. Again, no recognition of the thousands detained, mainly without trial, killed in what Israeli human rights organizations describe as torture centers. And so we are left to ask, painfully but honestly, are we less human? Is our suffering less worthy of being named? And are our lives less grievable? This is crucial because what was said in the early stages cannot be dismissed as provisional or incomplete. It has proven to be representative. It reveals a pattern, a theological and moral framework that even in the face of overwhelming evidence remains unable or unwilling to name reality for what it is. Let me move forward. My third point. I began with the incident of apartheid, the response to the war. And now my third point, the church and the reality of genocide. We must, at this point, clarify what we mean by the use of the word genocide, especially in relation to the position of churches and its continuing reluctance to employ this term. So let's talk about genocide. Genocide is not a slogan. It's not a rhetorical exaggeration. And it is certainly not a Palestinian invention. When we talk about genocide, we are adopting your framework to define what a genocide is and what a genocide is not. We did not write the definition. The definition came from the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide of 1948. You all know this, which was drafted in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Under this convention, genocide is defined as acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And you know the rest, the criteria. These acts include killing members of the group, causing seriously bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent birth, or forcibly transferring children. Now, this clarification matters because genocide is not limited to mass killing alone. It's not merely about a certain number. It includes the systematic destruction of people through starvation, displacement, the collapse of health systems, the destruction of homes, and the elimination of the basic conditions required for life. And based on this definition, based on this legal definition, the claim that Gaza is still facing a genocide, and I'm not talking in the past tense, I'm talking in the present tense, people are still being killed in Gaza and aid has not entered Gaza yet. The claim that Gaza is facing genocide is not emerging from fringe activists or ideological slogans. Please understand. It has been articulated through a growing body of evidence by respected institutions and experts across discipline and continents. Genocide scholars and legal experts, including Jewish and Israeli voices, have warned and have said that Israel's actions meet the threshold of genocide, or at the very least display clear genocidal patterns and intent. And again, look at the writings of someone like Amos Goldberg, who said that, who has argued clearly that Israel's actions constitute genocide. This is an Israeli Jewish scholar. He's not alone. There is Ras Sigal, another Jewish scholar, and many others. I have the names. In addition, major professional bodies in the field, including the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and also there's a statement by 800 of genocide scholars worldwide. They all have issued statements about the genocide. The same conclusion has been echoed by leading human rights organizations, the same human rights organizations that churches regularly cite in other contexts. But all of a sudden, when they talk about Palestine, they are dismissed. This includes Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and of course the Israeli B'Tselem, which came with a very damning report saying our genocide. Go and read it, it's a long report. This in addition to numerous UN reports, UN commissions, experts, and reports said that genocide conditions, intent, and the deliberate destruction of civilian lives is happening. Beyond the reports and moral warnings, it's now part of the legal landscape. The case before the ICJ, as we all know, has already been deemed plausible enough to warrant provisional measures, and the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants against Israeli leadership. So the question, friends, is not whether what Israel is committing a genocide is not. The question is, why aren't we talking about it? And why are churches hesitant and reluctant to naming it as genocide? That is the real question. Are we to understand, and this is my question to churches, I'm in Sweden, so I'll ask it to the Church of Sweden. Are we to understand that the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, all these UN experts, the hundreds of genocide scholars, including the Jewish and Israeli scholars, are they all mistaken, biased, dishonest? And if so, please tell us. Show us the evidence that they are all dishonest and mistaken. If the evidence is substantial and widespread as it appears, then the refusal to name genocide demands explanation. Now let me offer my own explanations to the silence of many churches to the question of genocide. As I said, first, one might reject the legitimacy of international law and its institutions altogether. Maybe, all of a sudden, we no longer believe in human rights and the legitimacy of the international law. And of course, this would be in direct contradiction to the church's own stated commissions. I'm talking about the Church of Sweden. And of course, here we must pause, because if the international law and these institutions are rendered irrelevant in Palestine, then, and let me be a bit blunt and controversial, why not for America to take Greenland? The oil in Venezuela, I heard, is good. Trump can take it. Russia can take Ukraine. Why not? If the international law means nothing in Palestine, then it means nothing elsewhere. Now I need to know, is this the position of churches? So maybe that's a possibility, that we reject the legitimacy of international law. Or one may implicitly or explicitly fail to see Palestinians as fully including within the moral and legal framework that the church affirms elsewhere. That's the second conclusion, that human rights don't apply to us. That's why we kept saying throughout this war that this war has convinced us that many in the international community and in the Western world do not look at us as equal human beings. In other words, the universality of human rights that the church boasts now becomes conditional, and the church positions itself in a superior moral position to decide who qualifies and who doesn't. Or maybe the third reason why many are hesitant to call a genocide, because they recognize the reality but refuse to name it, because they want to avoid the moral, theological, and political implications that such namings would entail, implications that would demand action, accountability, and perhaps even repentance. So let me remind you, you have told us that this war is a war of self-defense. There is a self-evident right for self-defense. In the case of the Church of Sweden, whose own statements describe Israel's actions as their self-evident right for self-defense, The refusal to name genocide cannot be understood as merely political caution. It reflects a deeper moral and theological failure. It reveals a theological framework that, over time, has treated certain institutions as sacred and untouchable, while rendering Palestinian existence as political, debatable, and ultimately secondary. Here, I want to quote from the second Kairos Palestine document. In it we say, genocide is not only a legal category, it is a structural sin against God, against humanity, and against creation. It stands in direct opposition to the commandment of love, the very summary of the law. And for us in Kairos Palestine, to deny genocide, despite overwhelming evidence, is not simply an error of judgment, it is a denial of the humanity of the Palestinian people themselves, according to Kairos Palestine. And therefore, it is a profound theological question. Therefore, a profound theological question must be asked. And again, let me quote from Kairos Palestine. How can one speak of Christian fellowship or communion while denying, supporting, justifying, or remaining silent before genocide, especially when such acts are committed in the name of God and Scripture and truth? This is one of the most important questions posed by Kairos Palestine to the international community. It's a question that demands honest reflection, repentance, and demands especially from church leaders. For this reason, naming reality is not simply about terminology, it is a theological task. Refusing to name genocide, especially when the evidence points to that direction, is not neutrality, it is complicity. And that's why I have come to believe with both grief and clarity that this refusal, when applied to Palestinians, must be confronted for what it is, a form of racism. Let me move to my fourth point before arriving at the conclusion. I hope you're still with me. I would like to talk about Christian Zionism. Now, clearly that the position of the Church of Sweden does not resemble the classical, traditional forms of Christian Zionism that we often associate with evangelical churches. It does not engage in apocalyptic speculation. It does not build its theology on eschatological fantasies. It does not interpret contemporary political events through a rigid prophetic lens. And to their credit, this has long been part of the Church's own theological self-understanding. Documents such as The Ways of God reflect a cautious approach, one that acknowledges themes such as covenant and land in relation to the Jewish people, while warning against drawing direct political conclusions from biblical texts. In this sense, it may indeed be correct to say that the Church of Sweden is not Christian Zionist in the classical evangelical way. We need to be fair. However, a lot depends on what we mean by Christian Zionism. Palestinian theology has consistently insisted, especially lately, that Christian Zionism is not limited to apocalyptic belief systems. At its core, it is much simpler and much more pervasive. It is, and this is how I define Christian Zionism, Christian support for Zionism as a political project. Christian Zionism as Christian support for Zionism as a political project. It is the theological, moral, and institutional support for the Zionist project in our land, regardless of how that support is justified or framed. And when we adopt this broader, and I would argue more accurate definition of Christian Zionism, a different picture emerges. Because when the Church refuses to name apartheid, when it refrains from calling what is happening in Gaza genocide, when it avoids demanding accountability, This, from our perspective, constitutes a form of liberal Christian Zionism. Yes, the language is different, the tone is more cautious, the theology is more nuanced, but the outcome is strikingly similar. Israel is effectively placed above international law. Israel enjoys a form of moral and political impunity. The church may not speak of Jewish exceptionalism or Zionist exceptionalism, but in practice, it enacts it through its positions and its silence. So as Palestinian Christians, we therefore have every right to ask, in what meaningful sense is the position of the Church of Sweden different from that of evangelical Christian Zionism? And I know this is a strong question and strong claim, but it is needed. Yes, there are differences, but the Church of Sweden, too, has not called for violence. It has not used the language of divine mandate to justify war. Yes, we agree. And yet at the beginning of this war, it offered what can only be described as uncritical defense, a defense that failed to take seriously the long history of occupation, apartheid, and systematic oppression. A defense that isolated October 7th from its broader context, a defense that intentionally or not functioned as a legitimization of the war, a defense that in the process dehumanized Palestinians. This is important because today we are witnessing something deeply alarming: the erosion of international law itself. We are living in a moment in which the norms that once governed global conduct, human rights, accountability, legal restraints are increasingly being ignored, violated, or reinterpreted according to power. And here we say this did not happen in a vacuum. And we could argue that the international community's failure to hold Israel accountable has contributed to this broader collapse. And this failure did not emerge only from conservative fundamentalist circles. When violations of international law are tolerated in one context, they become normalized in others, and when impunity is granted once, it becomes precedent. And this is where the responsibility of the church becomes more serious. Again, I say these words because I know that the Church of Sweden has presented itself as a strong advocate for international law and human rights, has spoken clearly in many contexts about justice, dignity, and accountability. In many ways, it was a leading force. And it's precisely for this reason it must be held accountable for its failure when it comes to the response to the genocide. This is an important point to stress. I want to conclude by pointing to the important document of Kairos, Palestine, which emerges as an important document of what we are describing theology after Gaza. And a lot of the arguments of Kairos, Palestine too emerged from conversations like this with church leaders, because we have realized, as I said, that Christian Zionism has been or has played a role in the ongoing genocide as it has in the ongoing Nakba of the Palestinians, both in its fundamentalist, evangelical, and progressive liberal support to Zionism by always putting Israel as an exception when it comes to the international law. So the theological response emerging from Kairos, Palestine in the second document has become a critical Kairos moment that needs engagement with. Kairos 2 says and believes that after what happened in Gaza, this moment demands more than commentary. It demands interruption. It requires that we pause and ask difficult and uncomfortable questions, not only about politics and international law, but about theology itself. Where were we? How did we read Scripture? What theological frameworks shaped our response or our silence? And most importantly, what must change? The scale and nature of the devastation in Gaza compels us to ask whether theology, as it has been practiced, has failed. More specifically, we must ask whether theology and biblical interpretation have, in some cases, been mobilized to justify, rationalize, or normalize extreme violence, or at the very least, to render the church silent in the face of that extreme violence, the genocide. This moment must be understood as a kairos moment, a moment of truth that demands clarity, courage, and prophetic speech. Kairos 2 captures this urgency with striking clarity. We reject euphemism and insist on naming reality as it is. And as such, Kairos 2 insists that we name genocide, ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism. And let me urge you here, stop talking about the conflict between Palestine and Israel. There is no Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Palestine is colonized. We live under apartheid. No one in the 80s spoke about the conflicts between the whites and the blacks in South Africa. We need to name apartheid, and we need to name the misuse of theology to justify or obscure injustice. Kairos 2 explicitly rejects the language of conflict, insisting that such terminology obscures power, erases history, and normalizes oppression. To call this a conflict is not neutral. It is an interpretive decision that carries moral and theological consequences. And therefore, a difficult but necessary question emerges. Again, I repeat the same question. Can there be genuine Christian fellowship where genocide is denied, justified, or ignored? Kairos 2 also calls for a deep and comprehensive theological reckoning. This should not be limited to conservative or evangelical traditions, some of whom are repenting and changing. But this call for comprehensive theological reckoning extends to liberal and ecumenical churches as well, particularly where the language of balance, dialogue, or peace has functioned to avoid moral clarity and delay accountability. It challenges all theological systems that sacralize power, exceptionalism, or entitlement, whether explicitly or implicitly. And at the same time, Kairos Palestine offers a constructive vision. We need to, and in Kairos Palestine, we insist on the need to distinguish between Judaism and Zionism. And we urge churches to open space for ethical and prophetical alliances, including with Jewish voices who oppose injustice. We need them. We need to hold these conversations together and alliances. Yes, we want dialogue, interfaith dialogue, but that dialogue must be grounded in truth, not in the management of injustice. Therefore, in Kairos 2, we openly call for boycotting all form of inter-religious dialogue that seek to manage injustice and normalize oppression. And we call for a reshaping of these interfaith dialogue where they are centered on justice, on creating alliances for truth. And in that context, as I said and repeat, we urge you to give space within your ecumenical bodies for the many and rising Jewish prophetic voices that challenge Zionism and the genocide. Kairos 2 confronts the misuse of the accusations of anti-Semitism to silence legitimate criticism and to prevent accountability. In doing so, we hold two essential commitments. We reject anti-Semitism in all its forms, and we also hold the refusal to allow that charge to be weaponized against those who speak for justice. And we can hold the two together. Kairos 2 further calls for creative resistance, not as violence, but as a theological and ethical imperative rooted in justice, dignity, and nonviolence. Boycotting those who commit war crimes is an ethical choice. I hope we understand it. It's an ethical and theological choice. So, actions such as boycott, divestment, and sanctions, these are not ends in themselves, but they are moral refusals of complicity and means towards transformation. And to be clear, we're not calling for boycotting settlement goods. I have not addressed much settler violence in this talk because of the nature of the talk. But every time we talk about settler violence and the response, we need to boycott settler goods. This is the system that protects them, sends them, gives them impunity, protects them. Settlers are part of the Zionist system. I hope you understand that. And Kairos Palestine calls for the reconfiguration of theological authority. The reconfiguration of theological authority. Theology must no longer be shaped exclusively by centers of power. It must emerge from the lived realities of those who suffer from Palestine, from the global south, from communities shaped by colonialism, racism, and systematic injustice. These voices are not peripheral. They are not merely contextual. These voices must be viewed as essential, indeed normative, for the life of the global church. I'm tired of people calling Palestinian theology contextual theology, and let's study it in minor classes. And the same applies to other contexts, Dalit theology, South African theology, and so on. At stake is nothing less than the credibility of our Christian witness. Because never again is a phrase that is often invoked in response to the horrors of the past genocides. But if it is not applied universally, it becomes empty. It becomes selective. It becomes in practice yet again. And what happened in Gaza showed that never again it's become one more time, yet again. Yet again, not just to violence and force and genocide, but to theology being used to justify it, and then also to churches being silent. One cannot affirm never again for one people while allowing the destruction of another. One cannot redeem one historical injustice by committing another. And so Gaza has exposed a profound contradiction, not only political but theological. And therefore, theology after Gaza, as called for by Kairos II, must be truthful, willing to name reality for what it is, must be repentant, acknowledging the failures and complicity of the church, must be decolonial, critically examining inherited frameworks shaped by empire, must be grounded in the lived realities, especially of those suffering and those resisting empire, and must be prophetic, willing to speak truth to power, even at cost. Ultimately, the question is not whether theology will change. The question is whether it will change in a way that restores its moral credibility, its spiritual integrity, and its faithfulness to the God of justice. Because if theology cannot speak truthfully in the face of Gaza, if it cannot name injustice, resist empire, and stand with the oppressed, then it risks losing not only its credibility, but its very soul. Thank you.
Thank you, Munther. Please take a seat there if you can. We will need you here because now we will have questions.
Okay, let me get the pen.
And you get a pen and you talk for 1 minute with your neighbor. Should we distinguish between Judaism and Zionism? Or how do we reconcile that with international law? Can you reflect on that with your neighbor? or anything else.